November 1944, Western Germany. When the American soldiers forced open the sealed train car, they expected to find cargo. What they found instead would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The roads of Western Germany had become rivers of chaos. Columns of refugees moved alongside retreating military units, their faces blank with exhaustion. Trains still ran, but without schedules anyone trusted. Rail lines that once moved coal and soldiers with industrial precision now carried anything that could still be moved. Supplies, wounded men, displaced civilians, prisoners, and sometimes nothing but sealed cars rolling without purpose through a landscape that no longer made sense. It was early morning when Lieutenant James Morrison and his patrol came across the train. The sun had barely cleared the horizon, painting the autumn sky in shades of grey and amber. Morrison was 26 years old, lean and weathered from 18 months of combat across France and into Germany. He had the kind of face that looked older than it should, eyes that had seen too much but still held onto something resembling hope. His uniform was worn but clean, his rifle slung across his back, with the casual readiness of a man who had learned to live with danger as a constant companion. The train stood motionless on a siding outside a small industrial town that had been abandoned days earlier. The station building was empty, its windows shattered, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes. The surrounding factories were silent, their smokestacks cold against the morning sky. No guards, no officers, no engine crew. The locomotive sat dead on the tracks, its fire long extinguished, its boiler cold to the touch. Morrison raised his hand, bringing the patrol to a halt. 8 men stopped behind him, their boots crunching on the gravel bed beside the tracks. Sergeant Frank Kowalski moved up beside him. Kowalski was 32, a Polish-American from Chicago with a broad face and steady eyes. He spoke German like a native, which made him invaluable in situations like this. The cars behind the locomotive were box cars, wooden freight cars, not passenger coaches. From the outside, the train looked like dozens of others the Americans had already passed in their advance east. Cargo left behind by a collapsing system. Supplies abandoned in the chaos of retreat. Nothing unusual. Nothing worth investigating. But then, Private Lucas noticed movement through a narrow ventilation slit near the top of one car. He was 19, a farm boy from Iowa, with freckles and a cowlick that refused to stay down no matter how much water he used. He had good eyes, the kind sharpened by years of scanning distant fields for livestock. Sir Lucas said quietly, "There's something in there." Morrison turned, following the private's gaze. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the weathered wood of the freight car, dark with age and rain. Then he saw it. A flicker of pale skin through the slit, fingers pressing against the gap. And then sound. Faint, too weak to be shouting, too irregular to be machinery. A tapping, deliberate and desperate. Wood being struck from inside with something hard. Knuckles, maybe, or the heel of a shoe. Then a voice. Thin, cracked, unmistakably female. The word came through clearly despite its weakness. Hilfe. Kowalski stiffened. Help, he translated, though Morrison had already understood. The tapping grew more insistent, joined by other sounds. Coughing, whimpering, movement inside the sealed car like something trapped and dying. And that word again, repeated now by multiple voices, layered and desperate. Hilfe, Hilfe, bitte, Hilfe. Morrison held up his hand again, this time for silence. His men froze, listening. The sounds continued, not the sounds of cargo, not the sounds of animals. Human sounds, suffering sounds. The kind that made something twist deep in your gut, no matter how hardened you thought you had become. Check the other cars, Morrison ordered. The patrol spread out along the train. 6 box cars in total, all sealed from the outside with heavy wooden bolts driven through metal brackets. Lucas moved to the second car, pressed his ear against the wood. More tapping. More voices. Corporal Hayes checked the third car. Same thing. PFC Martinez the fourth. All of them. Every single car. Sir Kowalski called from the rear of the train. They're all occupied. A weight pressed against Morrison's ribs, heavy and inescapable. 6 cars. All sealed. All containing people. And not a single guard in sight. No explanations. No orders. No documentation. Just locked freight cars on a dead train in an abandoned rail yard. He moved to the first car, the one where they had heard the initial cry for help. The voices inside had grown quieter now, as if the occupants were conserving what little strength they had left. Morrison studied the locking mechanism. Simple but effective. A wooden beam slotted through iron brackets secured with a length of wire twisted tight. It would take minutes to open, maybe less if they used tools. "Get this open," he said to Kowalski. "Carefully." Kowalski pulled wire cutters from his pack and began working on the twisted metal. The voices inside went silent, as if the occupants had heard the metallic clicking and were now waiting breath-held for whatever came next. Morrison positioned himself beside the door, one hand on his sidearm. Not because he expected resistance, but because 18 months of war had taught him to be ready for anything. The wire gave way with a sharp ping. Kowalski lifted the wooden beam free and let it drop to the gravel. He gripped the edge of the sliding door, glanced at Morrison for confirmation. Morrison nodded. The door slid open. What hit them first was the smell. It came rolling out of the car like something physical, a wave of human waste and sickness and rot that made Lucas turn away and gag. Morrison forced himself to breathe through his mouth, to focus on what he was seeing rather than what he was smelling. The interior of the car was dim, lit only by the grey morning light filtering through the open door and the narrow ventilation slits. As his eyes adjusted, Morrison could make out shapes, dozens of them. Women, packed together on the floor in a space meant for freight, not people. Some were sitting upright, but swaying, barely conscious. Others were lying completely still, arranged against the walls like bundles of rags. They were in conditions that defied description. Clothing torn and soiled, hair matted and crusted with dirt, skin stretched tight over bones, the kind of emaciation that spoke of weeks without proper food. Many had their eyes closed, too weak or too frightened to react to the sudden intrusion of light and fresh air. Those who were awake stared at the American soldiers with expressions that Morrison would remember for the rest of his life. Terror, pure animal terror. Several women recoiled as the light hit them, scrambling backward despite having nowhere to go. Hands went up instinctively, palms out in a gesture of surrender or protection or both. Some screamed, though the sounds that came out were barely more than croaks. Others simply whimpered, pressing themselves against the far wall as if distance alone could save them. And then, one voice cut through the confusion. Young female speaking in broken English that carried the weight of absolute desperation. "Bitte stop. Ich bin infiziert. Please stop. I am infected." Morrison froze. Kowalski beside him went rigid. Behind them, Lucas took an involuntary step backward. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Infected. The woman who had spoken was young, perhaps in her early 20s. She sat near the door, pressed against the wall with her knees drawn up to her chest. Her hair had been cut unevenly, likely by hand, with whatever sharp object she could find. Her face was sunken skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones, eyes dark and hollow, but still burning with a fierce, desperate intelligence. She wore what had once been a factory uniform, now torn and stained beyond recognition. No shoes, bare feet blackened with dirt and marked with sores. She raised her hands, palms out, and repeated herself. This time the English was clearer, as if she had been practicing the words, preparing for this exact moment. "Don't touch me, please. I'm infected." Behind her, several other women picked up the word. Infected. Infiziert. They said it like a warning, like a plea, like a curse. Some pointed to themselves. Others pointed to the bodies lying still against the walls. The word rippled through the car, gaining strength and panic as it spread. Morrison felt Kowalski's hand on his arm, pulling him back. "Sir, we need to seal this car. Now. If it's typhus or plague and we've just exposed ourselves—" Morrison shook him off gently but firmly. "Wait." He studied the woman who had first spoken, really looked at her. Not at her condition, which was appalling. Not at her words, which were terrifying. But at her eyes. At the way she was holding herself. At the specific nature of her fear. She was not trying to escape. The door was open now. Fresh air pouring in freedom just a few feet away. But she was not moving toward it. None of them were. They were pressing backward, away from the Americans, away from rescue, away from help. They were begging the soldiers not to come closer. That changed everything. Morrison held up both hands, palms out, mirroring the woman's gesture. He spoke slowly, clearly, hoping she would understand the tone even if the words were difficult. "We're not going to hurt you. Nobody's going to hurt you." Kowalski translated his voice, shaking slightly. The woman's eyes flickered between Morrison and the sergeant, searching for deception, for the trap she clearly expected. Morrison took a careful step closer to the doorway but did not enter the car. He kept his hands visible, his movements slow and deliberate. Behind him he could feel his men tensing, ready to pull him back if this turned dangerous. "Who are you?" Morrison asked through Kowalski. "Why are you here?" The woman's lips moved, but no sound came out at first. She had to try twice before the words would form. When they did, they came in German, rapid and tumbling over each other. Kowalski listened, his face growing paler with each sentence. "She says they're civilians," Kowalski translated. "Factory workers, clerks, students. Some were evacuated from bombed cities. Others were arrested for minor offenses, black market trading, refusing work assignments, criticizing the regime. A few were auxiliary workers attached to military units that don't exist anymore." Morrison nodded, encouraging her to continue. The woman took a shuddering breath and went on, the words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken. "They were loaded onto this train 3 weeks ago, told they were being relocated west away from the advancing front. Then the guards disappeared. The doors were locked from the outside. No food, very little water, no medical care." She paused, swallowing hard. Morrison could see her throat working dry and raw. "People got sick. First diarrhea, then fever, then rashes. Some developed open sores. Others began coughing blood. We tried to help each other, but we had nothing. No medicine, no bandages, just torn clothing and snowmelt collected in tin cups when the train stopped at sidings." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "One by one, people died. We stopped counting." Ice traced the length of Morrison's spine. He turned to Kowalski. "Ask her how many are dead." "In this car?" Kowalski asked. The woman's answer was barely audible. 23. 23 in this car alone." Morrison looked past her into the dim interior. Now that his eyes had fully adjusted, he could see them. Bodies arranged along the walls, covered with coats and torn fabric in a futile attempt at dignity. 23 women who had died in this sealed box, abandoned by their own people, left to rot like discarded cargo. He turned back to the patrol. Lucas had gone pale, one hand pressed over his mouth. Martinez was staring at the ground, jaw clenched. Hayes, the medic, was already pulling supplies from his pack, preparing for triage despite the risk of infection. Morrison made his decision. "Check the other cars, all of them. I want a count of survivors and casualties. And somebody get on the radio to HQ. Tell them we need medical support immediately. Quarantine protocols. Everything they've got." The men moved, grateful for clear orders for something concrete to do in the face of this horror. Kowalski stayed beside Morrison, waiting for further instructions. Morrison looked back at the young woman with the hollow eyes and the desperate fear. She was still watching him, still ready to flee or fight, or do whatever it took to survive just a few minutes longer. "What's your name?" he asked. Kowalski translated. The woman hesitated, as if giving her name might somehow make her more vulnerable, more real, more likely to be punished. But finally she answered. "Elsa. Elsa Weber." Elsa, Morrison repeated, committing it to memory. "We're going to help you. I know you're afraid. I know you don't trust us. But we're not going to leave you here." Elsa's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head slowly, desperately. "You don't understand. We're sick. We're infected. The guards told us if we got sick we would be shot. To prevent the plague from spreading, when they locked us in and left, we thought they were going to come back and kill us all. But they never came back. They just left us to die." Her voice broke on the last word. She pressed her hands to her face, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Morrison felt the words land like physical blows. 18 months of war. 18 months of death and destruction and cruelty. He had seen men blown apart by artillery, seen villages burned, seen children starving in the rubble of their homes. He thought he had become numb to it, that there was nothing left that could truly shock him. He had been wrong. Sir Hayes called from the second car. "Same situation here. Maybe 50 women. At least a dozen dead. They're in bad shape." Martinez's voice came from the third car. "Worse here, sir. children mixed in with the adults. Ages maybe 10 to 14. Half of them are unconscious. Kowalski moved to the fourth car and pulled the door open. Morrison saw him step back immediately, one hand going to his face. When he spoke, his voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. "Sir, you need to see this." Morrison crossed to the fourth car and looked inside. What he saw made his gut twist into knots. Bodies, stacked against the walls because there was no room left on the floor. 60 women Kowalski estimated based on the cramped conditions. Only 18 were still alive. The rest were dead, their bodies beginning to bloat and decay in the sealed, airless space. The smell was indescribable. Morrison forced himself to breathe through his mouth, to focus on the survivors rather than the dead. The living women in this car had given up hope. They sat among the bodies, too weak to move, too exhausted to care that rescue had finally arrived. Several did not even look up when the door opened. Morrison turned away, his mind racing. 6 cars. Approximately 240 women initially based on the cramped conditions and the numbers they were seeing. At least 80 dead. The rest in various stages of starvation, dehydration, and illness. Some would die even with medical care. The damage was already too severe, the deprivation too prolonged. This was not just abandonment. This was not just negligence. This was murder disguised as quarantine. Someone had sealed these women in these cars and left them to die slowly alone, forgotten. Morrison walked back to the first car where Elsa still sat pressed against the wall. She watched him approach with the same terrified intensity, as if each moment might be her last. He stopped at the doorway, removed his helmet and held it at his side, looked directly into her eyes and spoke in English, knowing Kowalski would translate, but hoping the tone would carry the meaning even before the words did. "Elsa, I'm Lieutenant James Morrison, United States Army. I give you my word that we are not going to hurt you. We are not going to shoot you. We are not going to leave you here to die." "Do you understand?" Kowalski translated. Elsa stared at Morrison, searching his face for deception. Finding none, she began to cry. Not the silent tears from before, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire frame. Around her, other women began to weep as well, the sound building and echoing in the confined space, until it became a chorus of grief and relief and desperate, fragile hope. Morrison waited until the crying had subsided into quiet sniffles before speaking again. "We're going to need to know what happened here. All of it. But first we're going to get you out of these cars and into proper shelter. We'll bring water and food. Not too much at first, because eating too quickly can be dangerous after starvation, but enough, and we'll bring doctors to treat the sick." He paused, letting Kowalski translate, then added the most important part. "You're safe now. The war is not over, but for you, the worst is behind you. That's a promise." Elsa wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing dirt across her cheeks. When she spoke, her voice was stronger than before, though still weak with exhaustion. "Why? Why do you help us? We are Germans. We are your enemy." Morrison considered the question. It was fair. It was reasonable, and it deserved an honest answer. "You're not soldiers," he said simply. "You're people. That's reason enough." Kowalski translated. Elsa absorbed the words, turning them over in her mind as if examining them for flaws or hidden meanings. Finally, she nodded. Just once. A small gesture of acceptance. From somewhere behind Morrison came the crackling of the field radio. The operator's voice cut through the morning air, reporting back to headquarters. "Medical emergency. Multiple casualties. Request immediate support. Quarantine protocols advised. Over." Morrison turned to Kowalski. "Get on that radio. Tell them we need a medical battalion here as fast as they can move. Tell them we've got at least 160 survivors in critical condition. Tell them whatever they're thinking in terms of supplies and personnel, it's not enough. We need more." Kowalski moved to comply. Morrison looked back at Elsa one more time. She was still watching him, but the terror in her eyes had been replaced by something else. Not quite trust. Not yet. But perhaps the beginning of it. The faint possibility that maybe, just maybe, these American soldiers were not the monsters she had been told to expect. Morrison allowed himself a small, tight smile. Then he turned and began organizing his men for the long process of evacuation and care. There was work to do, lives to save, a measure of dignity to restore to women who had been treated as less than human. It was going to be a long day. But for the first time in months, Morrison felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. Not destroying, not killing, but saving, helping, choosing mercy when every regulation said to choose caution. As the sun climbed higher in the German sky, the work began. And in the sealed freight car, Elsa Weber sat among her dying companions and allowed herself for the first time in 3 weeks to believe that she might actually survive to see tomorrow. The radio crackled with static before Captain Robert Davis's voice cut through sharp and commanding. ETA 15 minutes. Hold position. Do not, I repeat, do not enter those cars until I arrive with medical support. Acknowledge. Morrison keyed the handset. Acknowledged, sir. But be advised, conditions are critical. These women won't last much longer without water at minimum. 15 minutes, Lieutenant. Davis out. Morrison handed the radio back to the operator and looked at the row of sealed freight cars. 5 more still unopened. He had violated protocol by opening the first car, but the decision had been instinctive human. Now he faced a choice that would define not just his military career, but his understanding of what it meant to wear the uniform. Kowalski appeared at his elbow, canteen in hand. Sir, permission to distribute water while we wait. Morrison glanced at the canteen, then at the open car where Elsa and the other women sat watching them with hollow eyes. The regulations were clear. Suspected contagion meant quarantine. No contact until medical personnel established protocols. No sharing of supplies that might spread disease back to healthy troops. But regulations had been written by men who had never stood in front of a freight car full of dying women begging not to be touched because they thought mercy meant execution. Do it, Morrison said quietly. Small amounts. Make sure they understand to drink slowly. Kowalski nodded and moved toward the car. Morrison watched as the sergeant approached the doorway with both hands visible, holding the canteen like an offering. Elsa shrank back instinctively, but Kowalski spoke to her in German, his voice gentle and calm. He unscrewed the cap, took a small sip himself to show it was safe, then held it out to her. For a long moment, Elsa did not move. Then, with trembling hands, she reached for the canteen. Her fingers brushed Kowalski's as she took it, and Morrison saw her flinch at the human contact, as if she had forgotten what kindness felt like. She raised the canteen to her cracked lips and drank, not gulping but carefully, as if the water were precious beyond measure, which Morrison realized it was. After 3 weeks of melted snow collected in tin cups, clean water from an American canteen must have tasted like salvation. Lucas appeared beside Morrison, his young face troubled. Sir, the women in car 4, the ones with the bodies, they're asking if we're going to burn them. The cars, I mean, with everyone still inside. His throat constricted, words dying before they could form. Is that what they think we're going to do? That's what they were told would happen if plague broke out, Lucas said. Burn everything to stop the spread. They think we opened the doors to check if anyone was still alive before we torched the whole train. Morrison closed his eyes briefly. The depth of fear these women had been living with, the absolute certainty of their own worthlessness in the eyes of those who had imprisoned them, it was staggering. They had been locked in cars and abandoned. They had watched friends die. And even now, even with Americans offering water, they expected only fire and death. Tell them, Morrison said carefully, that we do not burn living people. Tell them we're here to help, not to kill. And tell them that even the dead will be treated with respect. Proper burials, marked graves, they won't be burned like trash. Lucas hurried off to deliver the message. Morrison turned his attention to the unopened cars. He could hear sounds from inside them now. Tapping, crying, the weak calls for help that had drawn them here in the first place. Each sealed door represented dozens more women in conditions as bad as or worse than what they had already seen. 15 minutes, Davis had said. Morrison checked his watch. 12 minutes now since the radio call. 12 minutes of unnecessary suffering while he waited for permission. He should not need to give dying people water. Hayes, he called to the medic. What's your assessment? Hayes looked up from where he was kneeling beside car 2, examining a woman through the open door without actually entering. Severe malnutrition across the board, sir. Dehydration. I'm seeing symptoms consistent with dysentery, probable lice infestation causing the rashes they thought were plague. Some cases of what might be tuberculosis, but that's chronic, not acute outbreak. Nothing here suggests epidemic disease. This is starvation and neglect, not contagion. Morrison absorbed this. So the infection fear was unfounded? Hayes nodded grimly. Unfounded but understandable given their condition. Malnutrition causes skin problems that can look like disease. Dehydration causes confusion and fever. Put desperate people in a sealed box for 3 weeks and tell them they have plague, and they'll believe it because the symptoms match closely enough. It's psychological as much as physical. The sound of engines announced Captain Davis's arrival before Morrison saw the vehicles. 2 trucks and a jeep rumbled into the rail yard, kicking up dust and gravel. Davis emerged from the jeep before it had fully stopped, a tall man in his early 40s with iron-grey hair and the rigid bearing of a career officer who had come up through the ranks the hard way. Behind him came a woman in Army Nurse Corps uniform, Captain Sarah Jennings, who moved with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen too many field hospitals and too much suffering to waste time on pleasantries. She carried a medical bag in one hand and had a stethoscope around her neck like a badge of office. "Report," Lieutenant Davis barked. Morrison laid it out quickly and precisely. 6 freight cars, approximately 240 women initially loaded 3 weeks ago, 80 confirmed dead so far, remainder in critical condition from starvation and dehydration. Suspected plague turns out to be malnutrition and neglect. No guards present, no documentation. Evidence suggests deliberate abandonment. Davis's jaw tightened as Morrison spoke. When the lieutenant finished, the captain turned to Jennings. "Captain, your assessment." Jennings was already moving toward the first open car, her trained eye taking in details Morrison had missed. "Refeeding syndrome is going to be our biggest risk," she said without preamble. "These women are severely malnourished. If we give them too much food too quickly, their bodies will shut down. We need controlled portions, specific nutrients, careful monitoring." She reached the doorway and looked inside. The women shrank back from this new authority figure, but Jennings's expression softened in a way that transcended language barriers. She set down her medical bag and held up both hands, showing they were empty of weapons or threats. "Tell them I'm a nurse," she said to Kowalski. "Tell them I'm here to help, not to harm." Kowalski translated. Elsa, still clutching Morrison's canteen, studied Jennings with cautious intensity. The nurse met her gaze steadily, then slowly reached into her bag and pulled out a clean white cloth. She dampened it with water from her own canteen and held it out to Elsa. "For your face," Kowalski translated Jennings's words. "To clean the dirt. Small comfort, but comfort nonetheless." Elsa stared at the cloth as if it were something alien. Then, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to distrust all offers of kindness, she took it. The moment her fingers closed on the white fabric, something broke in her expression. She pressed the cloth to her face and began to cry again, but quietly this time, the tears of someone who had been shown a tiny fragment of human decency after weeks of degradation. Jennings turned back to Davis. "Sir, we need to establish a field hospital immediately. These women need medical care that goes beyond what we can provide trackside. I recommend we transport them to the displaced persons camp at Mühlhausen. It's 30 kilometers from here, but it has the facilities we need." Davis nodded slowly, then looked at Morrison. The lieutenant had expected anger, perhaps even formal reprimand for opening the cars without authorization. Instead, Davis's expression was unreadable. "You violated quarantine protocol, Lieutenant?" "Yes, sir." "I did. You put your men at risk of infection. I assessed the risk as minimal based on the symptoms we observed, sir, and I determined that the risk of additional deaths from delayed care outweighed the risk of contagion." Davis was silent for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, his severe expression softened just slightly. "Sometimes the right decision and the regulation decision are not the same thing, Lieutenant. In this case, you chose correctly. But if any of my men contract typhus from this, I will have your bars." "Clear, Crystal." "Clear, sir." "Good." Davis turned to address the assembled soldiers. "Listen up. We're going to evacuate these women systematically. Captain Jennings will establish triage. Green tags for stable, yellow for serious, red for critical. We treat the reds first, but we treat everyone. And gentlemen," he paused for emphasis, "these are non-combatants who have suffered egregious abuse. You will treat them with dignity and respect at all times." "Anyone who fails to do so will answer to me personally." "Understood." A chorus of yes sirs rippled through the assembled men. Morrison felt something unknot in his chest. Davis was by the book, but he was not without humanity. The captain understood that some situations demanded flexibility, that rigid adherence to protocol could be its own form of cruelty. The evacuation began with careful precision. Jennings moved through the first car, examining each woman briefly but thoroughly. Her hands were gentle but professional as she checked pulses, looked at eyes and tongues, felt for fever. She marked each woman with coloured chalk, green or yellow or red, then moved to the next. Morrison watched Elsa receive a yellow mark, serious but not immediately critical. The young woman seemed almost disappointed, as if she had expected to be deemed too far gone to save. "You're going to be fine," Jennings told her through Kowalski. "You're dehydrated and malnourished, but your body is strong. With proper care, you'll recover." Elsa looked at Morrison as if seeking confirmation that this was real, that this wasn't some elaborate cruelty designed to give false hope before snatching it away. Morrison nodded once firmly. "She's telling you the truth," he said. "You're going to survive this." The next 2 hours became a blur of organized chaos. The able women were helped from the cars, first supported by American soldiers, as their atrophied muscles struggled to remember how to walk. Many collapsed immediately upon standing legs, giving out after weeks of cramped confinement. The soldiers caught them, lowered them gently to the ground, provided water and quiet reassurance. Lucas, the 19-year-old farm boy, found himself supporting an elderly woman who reminded him painfully of his grandmother. She wept into his shoulder as he carried her to the medical truck, her frail body weighing almost nothing. He settled her onto a stretcher with extraordinary care, tucking a blanket around her wasted frame. "Thank you," she whispered in broken English. "Thank you, American boy." Lucas had to turn away to hide his own tears. Martinez distributed what the soldiers called D-rations, hard chocolate bars from their own supplies. The women stared at the brown blocks as if they were treasures beyond price. Many had never tasted chocolate before Germany's rationing, having eliminated such luxuries years earlier. The first bites produced expressions of wonder that transcended the language barrier. One woman, middle-aged, with kind eyes and capable hands, despite her condition, introduced herself to Jennings as Margaret Hoffman. She had been a nurse in Berlin before her arrest, and even in her weakened state she organized the other women, helped translate, provided information about who was sickest and who had died first. "You're a nurse?" Jennings asked through Kowalski. Margareta nodded. "I was, before they arrested me for refusing to abandon my patients during an evacuation order." Jennings studied her for a long moment. "When we get to the camp, I'm going to need help caring for these women, someone who speaks German and understands medical care." "Interested?" Margareta's eyes widened. "You would trust me?" "A German?" Jennings smiled, the first real warmth Morrison had seen from the severe nurse. "A nurse is a nurse regardless of nationality. We take an oath to care for the sick. I suspect you take that oath as seriously as I do." Margaret straightened slightly, some echo of professional pride returning to her bearing. "I do, and I accept your offer." The removal of the bodies from Car 4 proved the most difficult task. The dead had been stacked with as much dignity as the living could manage, but 3 weeks in a sealed car had begun the process of decomposition. The soldiers who volunteered for this duty wrapped cloths around their faces and worked in grim silence, lifting each body with reverence despite the horror of it. Morrison insisted on helping, working alongside his men to carry the dead from the car and lay them in rows beside the tracks. Each body was covered with whatever fabric could be spared, a small gesture toward the dignity they had been denied in death. Elsa watched from where she sat, wrapped in an army blanket. When Morrison passed near her, she called out to him in halting English. "That woman there. Second from the end." Her name was Frau Müller. She was a seamstress from Dresden. She had 3 children. She died trying to share her last bit of bread with the younger women. Morrison stopped, looking at the covered form. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because someone should remember," Elsa said quietly. "Someone should know she was a person, not just a number, not just a body." Morrison knelt beside Elsa, meeting her eyes at the same level. "I'll make sure it's recorded. Frau Müller from Dresden, mother of 3, died sharing her bread. She'll be remembered." Elsa nodded, fresh tears tracking down her dirty cheeks. "Thank you." As the sun climbed toward noon, the last of the survivors were loaded into trucks for transport to the displaced persons camp. 165 women. 80 had died in those cars, their bodies now awaiting burial details and the paperwork that would try inadequately to explain how this had been allowed to happen. Morrison stood beside the empty freight cars, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the morning was draining away, leaving only the weight of what they had witnessed. Kowalski joined him, offering a cigarette. Morrison took it, even though he rarely smoked. They stood in silence, watching the last truck disappear down the road toward Mühlhausen. "You did good today, sir," Kowalski said finally. "We'll see if Davis agrees when he writes his report. Davis is fair. He'll write what happened, that you made the right call when regulations would have been the wrong one." Morrison drew on the cigarette, let the smoke burn his throat. "Those women thought we were going to shoot them, Frank. They thought the only reason we opened those doors was to check if anyone was alive before we burned the whole train. That's what they expected from us. Death. Not help. Not mercy. Just death." Kowalski nodded slowly. "And now they know different. That's worth something. Is it enough?" "It's a start." Morrison flicked the cigarette away and turned back toward the jeep. The day was far from over. There would be reports to file, statements to take, investigations to launch. Someone would have to account for this atrocity, explain how 240 women could be loaded onto a train and abandoned to die with no one noticing, no one caring, no one stopping it. But for now, 165 women were alive who might have been dead. They had been given water and food and medical care. They had been treated with dignity instead of cruelty. And perhaps most importantly, they had been shown that not all soldiers were monsters, that not all authority figures were executioners, that mercy was still possible even in the midst of war's brutality. It was not justice, not yet, but it was something, a small light in an ocean of darkness. And as Morrison climbed into the jeep to follow the convoy to Mühlhausen, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, that small light mattered more than he could yet understand. In the back of the last truck, Elsa Weber sat between two other survivors, the army blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. She clutched Morrison's canteen in her lap, like a talisman, this simple metal container that had been the first instrument of kindness she had experienced in months. Beside her, Margareta Hoffmann hummed quietly an old German lullaby that brought comfort without words. And as the truck rumbled toward an uncertain future, the women who had survived the train began slowly and tentatively to believe that perhaps survival was not the end of their story, but the beginning of something they had thought lost forever. Hope. The displaced persons camp at Mühlhausen had been established in what was once a German military training facility. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across cleared land, surrounded by wire fencing that now served to organize rather than imprison. American flags flew over buildings that had been repurposed for humanitarian care rather than military training. The irony was not lost on anyone. Morrison's jeep pulled through the main gate 3 hours after the evacuation had begun. The convoy of trucks carrying the survivors had arrived ahead of him, and already the camp was transforming into controlled chaos as medical personnel scrambled to accommodate 165 critically ill women. Captain Jennings had commandeered an entire barracks building, converting it into an emergency field hospital. Cots lined both walls, each one receiving a survivor, as they were unloaded from the trucks. Nurses moved between the beds with practiced efficiency, hanging IV bags, distributing blankets, recording vital signs on clipboards that would become part of a medical record these women had never possessed. Morrison found Elsa on a cot near the center of the room. Someone had helped her wash, and her face, cleaned of weeks of accumulated grime, revealed features that might have been pretty before starvation had carved them hollow. Her hair, still unevenly cut, had been combed back from her forehead. She wore a clean hospital gown, pale blue, and several sizes too large, but infinitely better than the rags she had arrived in. She was awake, staring at the ceiling, with an expression Morrison could not quite read. Not quite relief. Not quite fear. Something suspended between the two, as if she were waiting for the moment when this kindness would be revealed as temporary, conditional, or false. He pulled up a wooden chair and sat beside her cot. She turned her head to look at him, and for a moment neither spoke. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Elsa considered the question as if it were more complex than it seemed. "Strange," she said finally. Her English was improving with each conversation, the words coming more easily. "I feel strange. Clean, fed, safe. These are feelings I forgot existed. Morrison nodded. The doctors say you're going to recover fully. It will take time, but your body is strong. My body, perhaps. But here she touched her temple and here her chest over her heart. I think recovery takes longer. Before Morrison could respond, a commotion at the far end of the barracks drew his attention. A young girl, perhaps 16, had been brought in on a stretcher. She was conscious but disoriented, calling out in German as nurses tried to calm her. Morrison recognized the pattern, the confusion of someone who had been through trauma and could not quite accept that rescue was real. But Elsa's reaction was entirely different. She sat bolt upright in her cot, ignoring the IV line that pulled tight in her arm. The color drained from her already pale face, and she made a sound that was half gasp, half sob. "Anna," she whispered. Then louder. "Anna." She tried to stand, her weakened legs immediately buckling. Morrison caught her before she could fall, supporting her weight as she strained toward the girl on the stretcher. "That's my sister, Elsa," said desperately. "That's Anna. They told me she was in Munich. How is she here?" How Morrison signaled to a nurse who hurried over to help stabilize Elsa. But he did not try to restrain her. Instead, he supported her as she shuffled toward the stretcher where the girl lay, her movements unsteady but determined. "Anna," Elsa called again. The girl's head turned. Her eyes, dark and wide with confusion, focused on Elsa. For 3 heartbeats, there was only stunned silence. Then recognition bloomed across her face like sunrise. Elsa. They reached each other in the space between cots, Morrison and a nurse supporting Elsa, while another steadied Anna as she tried to sit up. The sisters grabbed for each other with desperate hands, their embrace graceless and fierce and utterly heedless of the medical equipment that tangled between them. "Ich dachte, du wärst tot," Elsa sobbed into Anna's shoulder. "I thought you were dead." "Ich auch," Anna replied, her voice breaking. "Me too." They collapsed together, sinking to the floor in a tangle of hospital gowns and IV lines and tears. Morrison knelt beside them carefully, ensuring the medical equipment remained connected while giving them space for their reunion. Around them, the barracks had gone silent, every nurse and patient witnessing this moment of impossible grace. Jennings appeared beside Morrison, her professional demeanor cracking slightly as she watched the sisters cling to each other. "How did this happen?" she asked quietly. Morrison shook his head. "I put in an urgent request to the Red Cross the day we found the train. They fast-tracked it because of the war crimes investigation. They were already compiling records of separated families from this sector. Anna was in a Munich facility that had just been liberated 2 days before you arrived here. The timing was extraordinary." Jennings was silent for a moment. "Sometimes Lieutenant God or fate or simple chance aligns in ways we cannot predict. This is one of those times." She moved to separate the sisters, gently explaining through Kowalski, who had followed Morrison into the barracks, that they needed to get Anna properly situated in a bed. But she promised they could remain side by side, that they would not be separated again. As Anna was lifted onto the cot next to Elsa's, she reached across the narrow gap to grasp her sister's hand. Their fingers intertwined, holding tight, as if physical connection was the only proof that this reunion was real. Elsa looked up at Morrison with eyes that shone with tears, and something fiercer, something like fierce gratitude mixed with disbelief. "You did this," she said. "You found her. You kept your promise." Morrison felt uncomfortable with the weight of her gratitude. "I made some calls. The Red Cross did the actual work." "No," Elsa insisted. "You cared enough to make those calls. That is what mattered. You are a good man, Lieutenant Morrison." He did not know how to respond to that, so he simply nodded and stepped back, allowing the medical staff to work. But as he moved toward the exit, Elsa called after him. "Lieutenant, one day when this war is over, I will find a way to repay this kindness. I promise you." Morrison paused at the doorway. "Just live well," he said. "That's payment enough." 3 days later, Morrison was summoned to Captain Davis's office. He expected a debriefing about the train incident, perhaps questions about the ongoing investigation into how the women had been abandoned. What he found instead was Davis seated across from a stern-looking colonel from the Judge Advocate General's office. "Lieutenant Morrison," the colonel said without preamble. "I'm Colonel Hartman. I've been assigned to investigate the circumstances surrounding the freight train you discovered. I understand you documented the scene thoroughly." Morrison nodded. "Yes, sir. We took photographs, recorded testimonies from survivors, and preserved the train cars as evidence. Good. Because what you stumbled onto appears to be part of a larger pattern. We've found 3 more abandoned trains in this sector alone. Different locations, same method. Women loaded onto freight cars, guards disappear, occupants left to die. Morrison's jaw tightened. How many total? Hartman's expression was grim. Approximately 600 women across 4 trains. Your discovery at Mühlhausen had the highest survival rate. The others, he paused, were found too late. The weight of that number, 600 women, settled over the room like a shroud. Morrison thought of Elsa and Anna, of Margareta, and all the others who had survived. They were the lucky ones. The thought was almost unbearable. We've apprehended 3 guards, Hartman continued. They've provided testimony implicating a local Nazi official who ordered the transports. He's fled east, likely into Soviet territory, but the guards themselves will face war crimes charges. Your documentation will be crucial to the prosecution. I'll provide whatever is needed, Sir Morrison said. Davis spoke up for the first time. The lieutenant acted appropriately under difficult circumstances, Colonel. His decision to provide immediate aid likely saved dozens of lives. Hartman nodded. I concur. In fact, Lieutenant, your actions are being cited as an example of proper conduct under the Geneva Convention. You treated non-combatants with dignity and provided medical care without delay. That's exactly how these situations should be handled. Morrison felt oddly hollow at the praise. He had simply done what seemed human, what felt right in the moment. The idea that such basic decency warranted commendation spoke to how far the standards had fallen. After the meeting concluded, Morrison returned to the camp. He had requested permission to remain in Mühlhausen during his unit's brief rest period, ostensibly to assist with the ongoing documentation. In truth, he felt a responsibility to see this through, to ensure the women he had found were properly cared for. He found Margaret in the medical barracks, now wearing a borrowed nurse's uniform and working alongside Jennings, as if she had always been part of the American Medical Corps. She moved between cots with quiet competence, checking temperatures, adjusting IV drips, offering words of comfort in German that needed no translation. You're a natural, Morrison told her. Margaret smiled, an expression that transformed her careworn face. This is what I was meant to do, Lieutenant. When they arrested me, I thought my life as a nurse was over. Now I see it was only interrupted. Captain Jennings has offered me a permanent position here, helping care for displaced persons as they arrive. You're staying? Where else would I go? My home in Berlin is rubble. My husband is dead. But here I can do good work. I can help people. That gives my life meaning again. Morrison understood. In the ruins of war, people rebuilt their lives with whatever materials they could find. For Margaret, that meant returning to the vocation that defined her, using her skills to ease suffering, even as she processed her own losses. Later that evening, as Morrison reviewed paperwork in the camp office, Margaret approached with an expression more grave than he had seen before. Lieutenant, there is something the women have not told you, something they are ashamed to speak of. Morrison set down his pen. Go on. The first week on the train before the guards disappeared, Margaret said quietly, 4 women were assaulted. 1 fought back. She had hidden a fork, used it to stab one of the guards. The guards beat her to death. Then they told us she had plague, that they had to kill her to stop the spread. Morrison's hands clenched on the desk. The infection story was a cover-up. Yes, they locked us in to hide what they had done. They expected us all to die. No witnesses, no evidence. When you opened those doors, you did more than save lives, Lieutenant. You exposed murder disguised as disease control. Morrison's voice was steel. I'll make sure this is documented. Those guards will answer for what they did. Margaret nodded. Justice will not bring back the dead, but it will honor them. Over the following days, Morrison watched the survivors begin the slow process of recovery. Bodies healed faster than minds, wounds closing while nightmares persisted. But there were moments of progress, small victories that felt monumental in context. He witnessed the first time Elsa laughed, a startled sound, prompted by something Anna said, as if she had forgotten that joy was possible. He saw women who had been too weak to stand now walking the grounds of the camp, their steps growing steadier each day. He watched as Margaret organized the survivors into a support network, women helping each other navigate the complex terrain of trauma and recovery. 5 days after the evacuation, the camp mess hall prepared a special meal for the recovering women. Not military rations, but real food, carefully calibrated for their delicate digestive systems, but with attention to taste and comfort. The mess tent filled with the unmistakable aroma of frying bacon. Elsa inhaled deeply, eyes widening. She had not smelled real meat in 6 months. Sergeant Mike O'Reilly, a stocky Irish-American from Brooklyn who ran the camp kitchen, placed a tray before her. Scrambled eggs, 3 strips of crispy bacon, buttered toast, and a cup of real coffee. Steam rose from the plate, carrying scents that seemed impossible after weeks of starvation. Elsa picked up a bacon strip with trembling fingers. The fat glistened in the morning light. She brought it to her lips, hesitated, as if afraid the moment would vanish, then bit down. The crisp exterior gave way to salty, smoky richness. Fat melted on her tongue, coating her mouth with flavors so intense they seemed almost painful. The taste was so overwhelming, so utterly unlike anything she had experienced in months, that tears spilled down her cheeks before she had finished chewing. Around the tent, the same scene repeated itself. Women crying over bacon. Not from sadness, but from the sudden shocking realization that pleasure still existed in the world. That food could be more than survival. That someone cared enough to give them not just sustenance, but comfort. Morrison watched from the doorway, Kowalski beside him. Lucas appeared on Morrison's other side, his young face puzzled. "Sir, they're crying over breakfast." Morrison's expression softened. "It's not about the bacon, Private. It's not even about the food. It's about being treated like human beings again. About someone showing them that they matter enough to deserve more than the bare minimum. That's what those tears are about." Kowalski nodded slowly. "We gave them back their dignity," he said quietly. "One bacon breakfast at a time." On Morrison's last day at Mühlhausen, before his unit was scheduled to move out, Elsa approached him carrying something wrapped in cloth. Anna stood beside her, the sisters now almost inseparable. Lieutenant Elsa said, her English now much improved. "I want to give you something." She unwrapped the cloth to reveal a piece of torn fabric, clearly cut from the factory uniform she had worn in the train. It was stained and worn, a remnant of the worst experience of her life. Morrison started to protest, but Elsa held up a hand. "Please, let me explain. I kept this piece to remember. To remember the fear, the hunger, the certainty that I would die alone and forgotten. But now I want you to have it. So you remember too. Not the horror, but the moment you chose to help instead of walk away. The moment your mercy gave me back my life." Morrison took the fabric, feeling its rough texture against his fingers. This seemed too personal, too weighted with meaning. But Elsa's eyes held such earnest hope that he could not refuse. "I'll keep it," he promised, "and I'll remember." "What will you do?" Elsa asked. After the war, Morrison considered. "Go home to Ohio, maybe teach school, try to build something instead of destroying. You have already built something, Lieutenant. You built hope where there was none. You built trust where there was only fear. That is no small thing." Anna spoke up, her voice soft but clear. "When I have children, I will tell them about the American lieutenant who saved their mother and their aunt. I will make sure they know that kindness exists, even in the darkest times." Morrison's chest tightened with an emotion he could not quite name. He had entered this war expecting to fight battles to defeat enemies to achieve military objectives. He had not expected to be changed by it, to have his understanding of courage and duty fundamentally reshaped by a freight car full of dying women who taught him that sometimes the bravest act is simply choosing compassion. The next morning, as Morrison prepared to leave Mühlhausen, Marguerite found him by the camp gate. She carried a small photograph recently taken by an army photographer. It showed Morrison standing between Elsa and Anna, all three of them smiling despite everything. Kowalski stood to one side, and Margaret herself was visible in the background. "A memory," Margareta said, handing him the photograph. "So you never forget what you did here." Morrison studied the image. He looked older in it than his 26 years marked by war, but not hardened beyond recognition. The sisters on either side of him looked fragile but alive, their eyes holding a light that had been absent in the train. "Thank you," he said simply. "No, Lieutenant. Thank you for seeing us as human beings when we had been treated as less than animals, for choosing mercy when regulations said to choose caution, for keeping a promise you had no obligation to make." She saluted him, a gesture of respect that transcended military protocol. Morrison returned the salute, then climbed into the jeep that would take him back to his unit. As Mühlhausen disappeared behind him, Morrison tucked the photograph and the piece of torn fabric into his jacket pocket close to his heart. He did not yet understand the full weight of what had happened, could not see how this moment would define the rest of his life. But he knew this much. He had looked into the face of suffering and chosen to act. He had violated protocol in service of a higher duty. He had treated enemies as fellow human beings deserving of dignity and care. And in doing so, he had discovered something essential about himself, about his country, and about the values worth fighting for, even in war's darkest hours. The road ahead stretched into uncertainty, the war still raging, more battles yet to come. But behind him, in a displaced persons camp that had become a sanctuary, 165 women were beginning to rebuild their lives. And that Morrison understood was victory of a kind no military campaign could achieve. A victory not of force, but of mercy. Not of conquest, but of compassion. The kind of victory that echoed not just through the remainder of the war, but across the decades that would follow, touching lives and shaping futures in ways none of them could yet imagine. 1946, 1 year after the war's end. James Morrison sat at the kitchen table of his parents' house in Ohio, now 27, but feeling decades older. The uniform hung in his closet unworn since his discharge. He was working toward a teaching certificate, trying to build the life he had promised himself during those dark months in Germany. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, postmarked from Munich. He recognized Margaretta's handwriting immediately. "Dear Lieutenant Morrison," she wrote in careful English. "I hope this letter finds you well and adjusting to civilian life. I wanted you to know what has become of the women you saved. Elsa and Anna Weber have opened a small bakery in Munich. The irony is not lost on them that Elsa was arrested for black market bread and now she bakes it legally. The business is thriving. Elsa married a carpenter named Friedrich, a good man who lost his first wife in the bombing. Anna is studying to become a teacher. She says she wants to help rebuild Germany by educating the next generation properly. As for the others, 32 have returned to what remains of their hometowns. 47 are still here at the camp waiting for paperwork or healing from deeper wounds. 12 have emigrated to America, sponsored by families of the soldiers who rescued them. The rest have scattered across Europe, trying to piece together new lives from the fragments of old ones. And they asked me to tell you something, Lieutenant. They asked me to tell you that the bacon breakfast changed everything. Not just the food, though. After so long starving, real food felt like a miracle. But the kindness behind it. The fact that someone cared enough to give us comfort, not just survival. That showed us we were still human, still worthy of small joys. It gave us permission to hope again. Morrison set down the letter, his vision blurring slightly. He had not allowed himself to think much about Mühlhausen, about the train, about Elsa's hollow eyes when she had first said, "Please stop. I'm infected." The memories were too heavy, too complicated with the weight of those who had not survived. But now, knowing that Elsa was baking bread, that Anna was teaching, that Margaret was still nursing it, felt like something loosening in his chest. Permission to believe that his choices had mattered. That mercy had consequences beyond the moment. He tucked the letter into the same box where he kept the photograph and Elsa's piece of torn fabric. Reminders of who he had been, who he had chosen to be, when the easy path would have been to follow regulations and let someone else decide. 1965, 20 years after the war. Morrison, now 46 and a high school history teacher, received an unexpected telegram. An invitation to Munich to a reunion organized by Margaret Hoffmann. 40 survivors would be there. They wanted to thank the men who had saved them. He almost declined. 2 decades had passed. He had a wife now, 2 teenage children, a life that did not include freight cars full of dying women. But something in Margaret's words, "We want you to see what Mercy built," pulled at him. Kowalski agreed to go with him. The sergeant, now 52 and running a hardware store in Chicago, had never really left that rail yard either. The reunion was held in a community center in Munich. Morrison walked in expecting ghosts, memories, uncomfortable gratitude. What he found instead was life. Elsa was there, 43 now, no longer hollow-cheeked, but solid and real. Her 2 children stood beside her. Maria, 14, with her mother's fierce eyes. Klaus, 12, named after Margaretta's dead husband. Anna, 36, and unmarried, taught at a local school. She had educated over 400 students in 20 years. Margaret, 54. Now, her hair more grey than brown embraced Morrison like family. "I have 2 children of my own now," she told him. "Both doctors. They grew up hearing about the American nurse who gave me back my purpose. The room filled with stories. Women who had become nurses, teachers, shopkeepers, mothers. Children who existed because their mothers had survived. Grandchildren already being born into a world their grandmothers had almost never seen." One woman approached Morrison shyly. "You don't remember me," she said through a translator. "I was in car 4, the worst car. I did not think I would last another day, but you and your men carried me out, gave me water, treated me like I mattered. I am 62 now. I have seen my daughter marry. I have held my grandson. None of that would have happened without you." Morrison's voice was rough. "I just opened a door." "No," Elsa said, appearing at his elbow. "You opened a future, for all of us." They took a photograph that day. 40 survivors. Morrison, Kowalski, and a few other soldiers who had made the journey. The caption would read, 1965, 20 years of freedom, thanks to mercy. Morrison stood between Elsa and Anna, just as he had in that first photograph from Mühlhausen. But now they were smiling without the shadow of death behind their eyes. Now the hope was real, permanent, built into the architecture of lives well lived. 1985. 40 years after the war. James Morrison was 66, retired from teaching but not from learning. When the local historical society asked if he would participate in an oral history project about World War II, he hesitated. But his wife encouraged him. "Your students should know," she said, "the real stories, not just the battles." The interviewer was young Ernest with a tape recorder and careful questions. "Tell me about your most memorable moment from the war," she asked. Morrison had prepared for this. He had thought he would talk about D-Day, about the liberation of towns, about the moment Germany surrendered. But when he opened his mouth, different words came out. "The proudest moment of my service," he said slowly, "was not on any battlefield. It was at a rail yard outside a town I can't even remember the name of now, when I gave a canteen of water to a dying woman who begged me not to touch her because she thought she was infected. When I chose to treat human beings with dignity instead of following the regulations that said to wait, to be cautious, to protect myself first." He pulled out the photograph from 1965, now faded and creased from being carried in his wallet for 20 years. Pointed to the faces. "That woman there, Elsa, she has 2 children and 4 grandchildren now. Her sister Anna taught over 400 students across her career. Margaret, the nurse, her children are both doctors who have saved countless lives. And that's just 3 women. There were 165 who survived." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "People ask me if I was a hero. I wasn't. I was a 26-year-old kid who couldn't walk away from suffering. But here's what I learned. Mercy doesn't just save lives in the moment. It ripples forward. Those women went on to build families, educate children, heal patients, contribute to their communities. Their children did the same. Their grandchildren are doing it now. So when you ask me what I'm proudest of, it's not that I opened a locked train car. It's what happened because I did. The lives that were lived. The kindness that was passed forward. The proof that even in war, even in the darkest moments, choosing compassion over convenience matters." The interviewer was quiet for a moment. "Do you still have any connection to the survivors?" Morrison reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a piece of worn fabric. "Elsa gave me this in 1944, a piece of her prison uniform. She kept it to remember her worst moment. Then she gave it to me so I would remember the moment I chose mercy." He refolded it carefully, tucked it back into his pocket next to his heart, where it had rested for 40 years. "I get letters still. From Elsa's children, from Anna's students who became teachers themselves, from women who were children in those train cars and are grandmothers now. They tell me about their lives, the ordinary, beautiful, impossible lives they got to live, because one day in November 1944, I decided that regulations mattered less than human dignity." His voice grew softer. "I didn't save them, really. I just gave them the chance to save themselves. And then I got to watch for 40 years as they did exactly that." The interviewer stopped the tape. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That's the most important story I've heard yet." Morrison looked at the photograph one more time. 40 faces, all of them marked by suffering but defined by survival. All of them proof that mercy was not weakness, that compassion was not foolishness, that choosing humanity over protocol was sometimes the most important decision a person could make. He thought about the train, about the smell of death, and the sound of Elsa's voice saying, "Please stop, I'm infected." About Kowalski's canteen, about bacon breakfasts, about Anna's unexpected arrival, about Margaret finding purpose in nursing again. And he thought about all the lives that had spiraled out from that moment. Thousands of people who existed because 165 women had survived. Students taught, patients healed, children raised. Kindnesses passed forward like currency that never depreciated. That Morrison understood as he had not fully understood even at the reunion 20 years prior was the true echo of mercy, not the single act but the endless reverberations. The way one choice made in a moment of crisis could reshape the architecture of the future in ways both small and vast. In November 1944, Lieutenant James Morrison had saved 165 women by choosing humanity over protocol. But the real miracle was not the rescue. The real miracle was the 40 years that followed. The lives lived, the love shared, the kindness multiplied. And somewhere in Munich, Elsa Weber, now 63, was closing her bakery for the evening. Her granddaughter, 8 years old and named Margarete, in honor of the nurse who had saved her grandmother's life, was helping wipe down the counters. "Tell me the story again, Oma," the girl said. "About the American soldier." Elsa smiled, as she always did when asked, pulled her granddaughter onto her lap despite the child's protests that she was too old for such things. "Once," she began, "in the darkest moment of my life when I thought I was going to die alone and forgotten, an American lieutenant opened a door. And when he did, he didn't just save my life. He gave me back my future. He gave me your mother. And he gave me you." The girl listened, eyes wide. "And that's why we bake bread." Elsa kissed the top of her granddaughter's head. "That's why we bake bread. Because once I was arrested for trying to feed people. And now I get to feed people every day, legally, joyfully, as a way of honoring the man who showed me that kindness is stronger than cruelty. That mercy echoes longer than hate." In Ohio, James Morrison turned off the lamp and went to bed. The photograph and the fabric went back into his nightstand drawer next to his wife's reading glasses and a stack of letters from Germany that he had saved for 40 years. He slept well that night, as he had not always slept in the years immediately following the war. And he dreamed not of battles or death, but of a freight car door opening, of sunlight streaming in, of a young woman named Elsa Weber taking her first sip of clean water and beginning slowly to believe in the possibility of tomorrow. And across an ocean, in bakeries and schoolhouses and hospitals, in living rooms and kitchens and parks, the women he had saved and their children and their children's children continued the work of living, of passing forward the kindness they had been shown, of proving with every ordinary day that mercy had been the right choice. Not because it was easy, not because it was regulation, but because it was human. And in the end, that was the only thing that truly mattered. The echo of mercy Morrison understood in the last moment before sleep claimed him never really fades. It just grows quieter over time, so subtle you might miss it if you weren't listening. But it's always there, always rippling forward, always changing the shape of the world in ways both seen and unseen, always worth it, always.